What's going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. I think there are about 4 decks that I could start this tier list with, and they consist of the majority of what you consider to be the defined tier 1. Supergiant is the newest of those and the ones that I've been playing the most of, so I think that this is going to be where we start here. Of course, the 4 decks we're talking about that could easily be the deck that starts this out are Shou, Star-Lord, Supergiant, and Doom 2099. Now, since I've been playing Supergiant for the last about 100 or so SP, I did a video on it yesterday. I'm still playing it today. It's just a very solid control archetype in this current metagame. Now, that is contextual. What is good about this deck is related to the things that it is trying to beat. This is a deck that is built to disrupt decks that are trying to combo off in really meaningful and on-board ways. So, an Activate Shou list, this deck has a lot of tools to try to deal with that, because their play lines can be a little bit predictable. A list like Doom 2099, not so many tools to deal with that, because the deck doesn't interact in the same ways, but you still can pull off some come-from-behind victories with your point package and, of course, the power of Negasonic and Supergiant. This is a deck that is mostly built to clean up decks like Star-Lord. That's where the good matchups start to show up, and anything that is really on board, like an all-in Havoc Invisible Woman First Steps deck, ends up being another very good matchup. Thanks to being a Scarlet Witch deck, you also have naturally better matchups into the Limbo package of archetypes. These are usually running around tier 2, but they're common enough that you should at least respect them. This is a deck that mostly is susceptible to getting big brothered by bigger mid-range decks. The losing matchups are things like Doom 2099 and Aura Shem that your tools don't line up particularly well against, because your tools are meant to pick apart decks that are doing something incredibly specific rather than just deal with decks that just kind of put points on the board. You are pretty okay contextually. That's the best overview I can give you of this list right now, and I've played it to the tune of about 100 SP climb post infinite. It's basically the only deck I've played. I'm top 20 right now. This is what I've been doing. I think we all kind of know what the deal here is with Shou. It's just a consistent point output deck that is meant to beat up on anything smaller than it. The output is forgiving, it's modular, you can deal with things that are trying to counter you. As far as I'm able to tell, the best ways to beat Shou are to either copy Gambit, Horseman of Death. That's a pretty good way to do it. It's a little worse against this because of the timing issues. You really want them to go off around turn 5 instead of on turn 6 after they've already created a bunch of giant scarlet spiders. So there's play in this deck against that line. And then the other thing you can do is just go over the top, because these are decks that have been slowly optimized into nearly a full points package outside of the Spider Ham, who, by the way, doesn't work the way you want him to for the 3rd separate different time, and Merlin. You really aren't really interacting with things, so it's very much going to be points for points. A lot of this is going to be pattern recognition. You should be favored into most of what I think I would affectionately term mid-range slop. You see someone playing Wiccan, you see someone playing Doom 2099. You should be able to create gameplay patterns, especially with just a Shou and a doubler, that don't necessarily rely on your full combo, but still go over the top of them. The name of the game with this deck is minimum necessary risk. There are going to be games where you can set up this incredible wombo combo of Jocasta stuff, but you don't need to. Your recognition skills as to what your opponent is playing are going to be stressed, because the more you go all in on the combo, the more you expose yourself to interaction. Things like Cosmic Ghost Rider, for example, or even a Lady Deathstrike can get you if it hits the Jocasta. So this is a list that has a ton of potential in it, but the skill expression is in knowing when you need to execute each individual part of the game plan. This is kind of the other deck I've been playing. This is just a very straightforward Star-Lord list, and while I will say that this is a notably powerful list, what I actually think defines this list is how little of a Star-Lord list it is. Like, yeah, okay, when you get your Star-Lord out on 4 because of a Psylocke, it's great. That's dope, awesome, amazing. There's a lot of decks where you're very much not doing that, where instead what you're doing is like, I'm going to Strife a Fin Fang Foom and then Zola it, or I'm going to like wave a Fin Fang Foom out and then win by going like Juggernaut and then moving the Fin Fang Foom with a Grandmaster. Things like that are like a lot more common for actually playing this deck. It's a deck that has an unbelievably high amount of ability to win games where it's not comboing off. And that's actually most of the appeal to me, is that I don't have to just be a Star-Lord deck. Obviously, when you do the combo, it's great. Another card I want to specifically point out in here is Strife. Strife is good. He's a floor raiser. He's an additional piece of engine. He's a great way for you to limp into games that otherwise are not games you're going to win with a combo, but that is a debatable upside in a world where you compare him with something like Legion, who is not going to help you limp, but he will win you 8 cubes a certain amount of the time, in the way Strife tends to be played for lower cube amounts thanks to being a little bit face up. That's what he is. So there is a dynamic there where I think you could argue either way. And then at the 1-drop spot, Jim Hammond is not nearly as good as he used to be. This deck used to be much more consistently able to do a Star-Lord combo. There are going to be plenty of games where Jim Hammond is not just a 1-7 or a 1-5. He'll just be a 1-2. Like, you do not need to replace him with like a card that is doing things like Jim Hammond. You're not going to get nearly as much out of like a Sunspot here. What you should be looking at to replace Jim Hammond is like Echo or Legion or something like that. Just like something, he's really not contributing all that much. Like, he's there, he's fine, he's much worse than he used to be. Doom 2099 is kind of the floor deck of this metagame to me, where this is about as bad as you're allowed to be and still be a deck that I respect. This is a deck that is extremely straightforward. A good player can punish you. I think particularly the Doom 2099 Shou matchup, it is very incumbent on the Shou player to understand that matchup. Whereas the big advantage of a Doom 2099 deck is like all this stuff I talk about understanding matchups and all that, it kind of puts the onus to know what to do in a matchup on your opponent, right? You have to adapt to me because I'm doing the same thing every game, and you have to figure out if your deck has the tools to beat it. Good luck with that, right? One of the cards that I really want to praise in a deck like this is Iska. Doom 2099 has not really had a ton of ways to go vertical. You can look at the 6s and you can sort of see why. Both 6s are horizontal across the board, and like they kind of have to be like that, but sometimes a deck like this needs the ability to go vertical, and Iska, with just one activation of the Invisible Woman First Steps, you play her on 4, she's gonna be a threat. Like, she'll be at 6, threatening 24 if your opponent is able to do that. And that is just a really, really powerful thing for you to be able to bring to bear. This is a deck that has just a ton of good cards in it. It's just a classic, good, strong deck that, yes, a lot of good players will take advantage of the play pattern against. They will do math onto what happens if I play Aurora, and then you get a Doombot here, and if I beat that, I'm going to win 100% of the time, so I'm going to stay and I'm going to beat you. Yes, you are predictable, but that's not necessarily the death knell for this deck. And I think its weaknesses and its strengths are intertwined. You are predictable if your opponent is good enough, but if you can just make your opponents not be good enough, like, or have them draw their cards in the wrong order, like, it's not like they always have the ability to do this, you know? Like, asking questions is good. Demanding answers from your opponent rather than having a bunch of answers yourself, that's a valuable position to put yourself in. And this deck puts itself in the driver's seat against basically everything in the format. I think Leehand is a little underplayed, personally. This is still a deck I have a ton of respect for. It's very much like positioned here. Like, I would call it roughly deck number 5 in the format, but it is a deck that has unique angles against a lot of this stuff. Like, this is a deck, Gambit is so unbelievably good against Supergiant. It's fairly pretty good against Shou. Like, there's just a lot of good eats for a deck like this. And there are some bad ones, right? Like, it's not very good against Doom 2099 at all. It's way, way worse against Star-Lord. Yes, that's true. But like, this is a deck that looks at what I would consider the top 4 decks of this format and says, you know, split them. I think I'm good against 2 and bad against the other 2. And it's like, that's not really a bad position to be in. this is still a deck that has a lot of inbuilt utility. Like, I particularly enjoy the way this deck has to pick and choose how it's going to approach each game. Lin-Li, when you need to go tall against a ramp deck or a Doom 2099 deck, super valuable. That kind of stuff is particularly important. I have genuinely enjoyed him in here. Being able to choose between Gambit, Lin-Li, and V-Hand as targets, just having that third target in there is so good. Not having to be a Misery Hood deck. Like, Misery Hood is amazing, but... big but here, it does come with some real commensurate downsides, and getting rid of the Misery makes this deck a lot more flexible. Getting rid of the Hood helps to alleviate some of the issues this list can have when it comes to board space games. This is one of the few decks that, like, if I'm playing a Shou list and my opponent snaps having played, like, anything from this list, I probably have to respect that they're going to play 2 Gambits on me and see if I actually have the ability to beat that. And a lot of the time I just don't, right? Like, this deck has bully snaps against Shou, it has bully snaps against Supergiant. It's in a really reasonable spot. And even the lists that are not particularly good to Gambit, like Doom 2099, the matchup really isn't that bad if you can get some Lin-Lis down. It is legitimately very winnable. You do have to be concerned with things like Cosmic Ghost Rider, but you can go pretty damn tall. Things get a lot less defined after that group of decks. That group of decks is largely what I would consider the meta. And then there is a sort of wide glut of people trying things and experimenting and responding to the ways in which those decks are influencing other things. For example, here is a Batroc list from Derek that is particularly interestingly tuned in a world where people aren't playing a lot of Lee Hand. Remember, the thing that chased Batroc out of this metagame was Gambit. That is the big reason why Batroc fell behind. There is a sort of tertiary or secondary thing happening here where it's also ended up being a slightly worse hybrid with Shou than the ongoing Shou list and the Activate Shou list, which are much more combo oriented and kind of win that heads up mirror, and it doesn't really have tech to interact with those cards. That said, Batroc isn't only a Shou list, and it doesn't have to be. You can do other stuff with your Batroc combo, and Batroc is still one of the best scaling packages in the entire game as long as you don't have someone in your ear reminding you that Gambit Horseman of Death exists. This is still an unbelievably powerful package at scaling upwards and upwards and upwards and upwards and upwards, and it is a very reasonable thing to do if you are going to play a deck like this. Now note also the Professor X. This gives you some real upside into decks like Star-Lord. Now, Star-Lord is typically the kind of thing a deck like this really has to worry about. You know, oh, I'm going to get outscaled. They're going to go over the top of me. Not if their stuff doesn't happen. Oh, I've got a Cosmo down on the mid lane and then I Professor X a side lane. None of your Arnim Zola stuff happens. None of that extra energy happens. And you can actually just do that, right? And because your combo stuff, your early game Batroc, Craven, Sam Wilson stuff is so good at taking priority, you're gonna have it and you're gonna be able to do that, right? Like, it's a very real threat to those decks that you can just set up a checkmate. Perhaps more traditional version of Batroc is hybridizing it into the Supergiant package. I think this deck actually pretty handily beats the other Supergiant list and is pretty good into Star-Lord and is pretty good into Shou. Honestly, this could be a real sleeper, to be honest with you. The good draws from this, the scalers in this deck are so much better than in the more static Debrii Batroc list. You lose out on some of the explosive power, like no Iron Patriot, no Askani'son, means that you're going to be able to have less free guys, but the payoff for that is just amazing, amazing scalers. And those scalers are a very, very real threat. They are so serious. They are so good. This scaling package is genuinely as good as it gets. And what do you need when you have a scaling package that's as good as it gets? You need something to prevent the combo decks from going over the top of you. The Supergiant package does that better than anything else in this metagame. So I think that this one, very real chance at being a sleeper here. This list from Pixie Chef is a classic deck that is just trying to do as many points as possible. It's looking at a metagame full of stuff that is pretty combo-ish and saying, What if I comboed harder? What if I made a 40 power Infinite and then Taskmastered it? That is what I am going to try to do, and it is a very, very reasonable way to try to play Marvel Snap in this current era. Now, you are going to have to think about things like, okay, I need to get that 40 power Infinite in the back row. I need to not be playing against someone who has a Shang-Chi or even a Shadow King. That kind of stuff could be bad for me. I don't want to get like Goliath out of various versions of the Star-Lord list, because then I won't be able to actually play the Taskmaster. Like there's stuff you got to think about here. I think the Star-Lord list is the closest comparison for this, in that I suspect the Star-Lord list is better, but this is operating in a fairly similar space, and sometimes will be able to go over the top, but has less notable interaction. One of the things this deck really loses out on compared to Star-Lord is Juggernaut and Goliath, which are very lockdown-oriented game pieces that this deck never really has access to. This is a deck that is a lot less willing to interact with its opponent, a lot less guaranteed wins, a lot more I'm afraid of something happening, but I'm still going to play the game out kind of stuff. And then against like Doom 2099, they just can't beat a 40 power Infinite and a Taskmaster, so you got that going for you. An interesting use of Strife here that caught my eye. Aurora, a deck that is a little low on power, but if we're entering a metagame where I genuinely think Supergiant is as good as it is, Aurora is definitely a deck that can keep up there, and it's the kind of deck that is not necessarily particularly amazingly easy for Supergiant to beat, and beyond that, there's a really interesting thing going on here where Strife lets Aurora sit in hand, so you can actually play the card Juggernaut in this deck, and that's actually a really big upgrade. Like, this is a deck that really, really, really wanted to be able to play Juggernaut and just simply never was able to because it had to play Aurora on 6. Being able to Juggernaut in this deck, thanks to what Strife is allowing you to do, is a legitimate, serious business, great upgrade for this deck to get. And I think it's a very unique usage of Strife that people should probably be paying attention to. It's been a while since Aurora decks were able to really compete on power, but if you have that interaction on the level of a Juggernaut being introduced into a deck that was only a little bit below the power of some of the other stuff going on, there might be some serious work being able to be put in here. Now, there are like associated costs, right? Like we have a Legion in here instead of a Stardust, right? Because we don't have like a Scarlet Witch or anything like that. There are costs to like our ability to output points. There are limits on this deck, but the Strife Juggernaut Aurora thing, that looks pretty compelling to me. Arguably Marvel Snap's most consistent deck for the last 3 months or so, Ramp has maintained a relatively tier 2-ish to tier 1-ish position in basically every metagame we've had. I can think of nothing bad to say about Ramp. This is one of my absolute favorite decks to play. It is a very solid deck that I think is a little bit similar to Doom 2099, but the point output is just a little bit lower. And that's a reasonable spot to be. Doom 2099, of course, is a deck that goes wide very powerfully. Ramp is a deck that goes tall very powerfully. It's a very straightforward deck, but again, it is usually good to put the onus on your opponent. The nerf to Fin Fang Foom, I think, hurt Ramp a pretty decent amount. You might not see it, but like a lot of the time, the final turn for this deck is just playing a Fin Fang Foom. And when that's your entire turn and you've had, 3 months of people getting used to playing around it and it's 2 points of power less, I almost feel like it hurt this deck a lot more than it hurt a deck like Star-Lord that is really going into like just multiplying the amount of Fin Fang Fooms they play per game. Whereas like I'm playing an honest Fin Fang Foom here. It's a lot worse. Shem is a deck I think people misunderstand. I've had a lot of conversations about Shem over the past week, and so I just kind of wanted to lay down what my understanding of this list actually is and what the deck's role typically is and has been in previous metagames, and why that I feel is clinging to it and sort of obscuring the way that people should actually perceive this deck. Shem was a deck very similar to Wiccan, whose purpose was largely to be a tech deck that was bigger and beat other tech decks. It had access to a lot of the same tools as other tech decks had back in the day when Shang-Chi was still a metagame defining card. This was the kind of deck that would beat a lot of Shang-Chi decks because Shem simply just output more points than them and was able to leverage a lot of the same tools. This energy advantage that it was able to leverage allowed it to become a sort of mythological figure. I think a lot of people think that Shem is an impossible deck to play against, but really, one of the things that's pretty true about this deck is it doesn't always do the same thing, but it does a lot of things in the same shape. Playing against Shem is playing against an outline of something, and if you get got by whatever specific thing, you just have to accept that as the cost of doing business. It's not really all that different from someone including a card in the deck that you didn't necessarily feel like playing around, or think they would be reasonable to include in the deck. That's just kind of how it is. So Shem's role in metagames has typically been to big brother mid-range decks, right? It's been to be a little bit bigger than the control heavy tech kind of mid-range, right? An example of that right now is Supergiant. I think Shem is a particularly favored matchup into Supergiant. Just a very, very solid. The shape of Shem generally is going to be pretty good into Supergiant. They're going to be able to get ahead. It's a lot harder for Supergiant to take priority and leverage their priority package if they aren't actually going to be playing the biggest things on every turn. So Shem's energy advantage naturally works to its favor in that matchup, and it is able to set up situations that are confusing, weird, out of bounds, and kind of difficult to play against for a deck that is particularly convinced that it needs to take apart specific things. Supergiant is a deck that is about taking the pin out of something and watching the whole house of cards collapse. Shem isn't really building a house of cards in the same way like a fully synergistic deck is, so it's a lot harder to remove one piece of it and have it all fall apart. But the counterexample is when decks that are pretty straightforward points decks get good enough, then they can execute their game plans more consistently than Shem, and it becomes a question of points. And so Doom 2099, for example, not a matchup you particularly want to see, even though it is a predictable deck. The predictable part of it is that it's going over the top of you a lot of the time. This is a deck that fundamentally is built and generally functions as a deck that beats control-y mid-range decks. That's what it's about. There aren't nearly as many of those in current Marvel Snap as there were 6 months ago, 9 months ago, before the Techpocalypse, before Invisible Woman First Steps, before all of this stuff, right? Now, it is almost a deck that doesn't necessarily have a home. And I know people are going to talk about like, oh, Shem in Conquest. Oh, it's like a totally different dynamic because, you know, I don't have to like they get to have RNG in their deck and there's no benefit to like learning my opponent's cards over the course of a conquest. And I think that's a very real dynamic that's at play. But I also think it's a little bit overstated in terms of why this deck actually sees play, what this deck's actual metagame function is. And its metagame function is largely 90% big brother control-y mid-range decks, 10% you randomly win because you generated something, right? Like, it's a lot more about what the deck is doing than about what the deck has the potential to do. And I think I just wanted to get that out there so people understood where my head was at on Shem. Like, a lot of the reason it typically ends up being pretty good in early weeks of the season is because it takes a while for people to figure out what the best just like static points output deck is and what the best sort of synergistic thing that's going really tall does. And with this change, it's definitely gotten to a point where within like 4 days of the season, people are playing Doom 2099. They're playing Shou Activate, and you're just like, oh my God, what am I even doing? These decks just have infinitely more points than me, and unless I get my one card in this deck that can actually win me the game in my deck of 24 cards, I'm dead. And it's just not a great spot to be in. Invisible Woman First Steps is a reasonable deck. There's nothing wrong with Invisible Woman First Steps. Or, I don't know, maybe there is, right? Like, Invisible Woman First Steps is sort of the patient zero of decks that are why the metagame is the way that it is. People look at the Techpocalypse and they say, this is when Marvel Snap changed to be being about 2 ships passing in the night's decks. I don't think that's true. I think it was Invisible Woman First Steps. I think that's when this actually happened. And you can see it now in a way because a lot of decks kind of just spiritually are Invisible Woman First Steps decks. It's a deck where the idea is to put 2 cards together that are generally pretty good anyway, but if you put them together in a certain way, they become exponential, right? This is pretty familiar, right? That's Shou. I'm describing Shou. I'm describing Star-Lord, right? Like, that's what these cards are. And in the context of that, the thing that holds Invisible One first steps back is that it just has less ability to customize itself. It's kind of almost a theme deck, you know? Like, this is the kind of deck that in another TCG you would go and you would buy as a starter deck for 20 bucks, right? Like, this is, it's just all the cards that say a certain keyword on it, and then the cards that work with that keyword. You don't get a lot of maneuverability here. You don't get a lot of room to breathe. You don't get a lot of things that are going to be happening. And that's unfortunately just kind of where IWFS has found herself. I felt like it would be pretty important to have at least one representative of the Magik Mafia on this list, and it's hard to figure out which one it's supposed to be. And I think when I say the Magik Mafia, you kind of understand what I'm talking about, right? Like, it's just combo decks that are doing magic things, right? So you end up with this, Living Tribunal, the Onslaught decks where you're trying to copy Mr. Fantastic a bunch of times. They're all kind of the same thing. And so fundamentally, the way to combat all of them is to have location changers in your deck so you aren't getting obliterated by anything that's demanding a turn 7. Like this, you know, things that are going to be like She-Hulking and Infinauting on the final turn of the game. There's a lot of decks that are just, you know, the Magik Mafia. That's what they are. And Zombie Galacti, to me, is the one that is the scariest to play against because the output is so wacky, so random, so hidden, where Tribunal and the Arms deck, very mathable, very interactable, very predictable in ways that I really just don't think are true for Zombie Galacti. I think that this is the scariest of the Magik Mafia decks, but it's still one of the Magik Mafia, and if you want to beat it, you can. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for bearing with me on this one. I don't know if you can tell, but I am actually quite under the weather right now. I think I caught a cold from my fiance. So obviously, shout out to her. Shout out to whoever invented colds. Thank you so much for watching. I have been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. And I will see you in the next one.